Look, this will be an ongoing threat to people for years and decades at a lower level than it was during the height. So, yes, it's time to empower people with the best information and know that people have a stake in protecting themselves and when we move on.
Welcome back. That was Colorado's Democratic Governor Jared Polis talking about his state's new approach to coronavirus with Chuck Todd last week on this very program. And as we said at the top of the show, nearly 2 years into the pandemic, which also happens to be less than a year before the 22 midterms, some Democratic governors are now changing their minds and their messaging on COVID restrictions. Joining me now to talk about it all is former RNC chair and MSNBC political analyst Michael Steele. Also with me here in the studio, very happy to have the Washington Post's Mariana Sotomayor and former senior advisor to Vice President Harris and now MSNBC host Symone Sanders. So, Symone, I'll start with you. These Democratic governors now getting perhaps out ahead of the CDC, out ahead of the White House. Is the White House frustrated by that, or are they just happy to have somebody else testing the waters on these policies?
Well, I think you'd have to ask the White House what their official policy there is and how they feel. Look, I think Democratic governors, particularly folks who are up in this midterm election, which is a lot of them, key places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, like go down the line, Ohio.
States we're used to talking about.
States where we know a little something about. I think that they are looking at the lay of the land, and it's not just governors, it's mayors across the country. It is other elected officials, and what they don't want are policies that have people, for lack of a better term, pissed at them at the ballot box. So are these moves backed by science? I think a lot of these Democratic governors, they know their states better than we do sitting here at this panel. These mayors know their cities and municipalities better than we do. So I think we have to take them at their word. But for me, I'm still wearing my mask.
As well you should. How tricky is the politics here for Democratic governors and candidates? I want to put up the Stacey Abrams photo, which I think our viewers are probably all familiar with, this picture of her unmasked in a classroom full of children. Republicans jumped all over this. They talked about it as hypocrisy. This kind of thing, how big of a problem is that for Democrats broadly, the idea of, COVID hypocrisy as an issue, and that photo in particular for her?
Well, look, I think, first of all, we have to look at the facts, and the facts are that Democrats across the board, including this White House, the Biden-Harris administration, they have done an extremely good job at leading by example, right? Very different than a number of their Republican counterparts. These are folks that said, look, we're going to lead by example. We're going to wear the mask. Folks who have taken vaccines publicly on camera, right, both shots plus their boosters. I think that consistency here is the point, and candidates have to be extremely vigilant coming up in this election cycle, particularly Democratic gubernatorial candidates and also Republicans. So I think this is where the staff needs to step up a little bit here and do that last look before your candidate goes out, because that photo of Leader Abrams could have been avoided.
Michael, I want to bring you in here. This recent Monmouth poll we've been looking at, saying Republicans and independents both say that COVID is here, it's not going away. Democrats are lagging when you look at that. Do Republicans see an opportunity here to kind of capture the prevailing sentiment around COVID politics, or at least draw in those independents who are always the prize in midterm elections?
Yeah, they do. I think they recognize a certain reality about COVID, irrespective of times when they want to ignore the science, because the politics on COVID works for them. And I think that's why you see the Democratic governors moving the way they are on this issue. They want to put it past them. The governors don't want this to be an issue in their states going forward. Republicans do. But they do because there is an underlying sentiment, regardless of everything else, among the American people that, okay, we've done all that we think we can do. We've done all that you've asked us to do. At what point do we at least begin to move back into a sense of normal, whatever that may be? And I think Republicans have found a way to sort of pick at that over and over again for political purposes. But the reality still remains that there are some cautionary tales out there, and there's still, we haven't completely turned the corner. So there's always this danger that spikes could come and then the narrative changes. But for right now, Republicans see they have the upper hand on this. It's reflected in the polling among a lot of voters, and the Democrats are now playing a little bit of catch up to that.
Mariana, before you were covering Congress, you covered the Biden campaign. You know that COVID was like the turning point issue for him. It has been the issue on which his political fortunes have risen and fallen over the last, year and a half now, I guess. Not quite a year and a half, a little more than a year. It feels longer. Yeah. Is getting past this Omicron surge the key now for the Biden administration? And do you think they'll be scared to touch the hot stove of declaring victory again after what we saw happen last summer?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a test. We were there. We were always watching how Biden would respond to the COVID pandemic. And what really helped him was the fact that a lot of people were watching Trump's missteps, the fact that he was promoting misinformation. He wasn't necessarily, as what people were seeing at the time and polling showed, responding to this pandemic right away or in ways that they thought was the right way. And, you mentioned how the Biden administration, the Biden campaign at the time took preventative steps. But that declaration on July 4th saying, we're turning the curve was pretty early. And a lot of people, I think, followed that and said, OK, we're getting there. We're getting to a point where COVID isn't necessarily something that we still have to look at. It's maybe something that we can keep in the past. But that declaration and then Omicron, which just a lot of people did not see coming, and the lag in testing and the long lines that we saw. I mean, people are definitely starting to question whether they can have a hold on this moving forward.
I mean, the point that people didn't see Omicron coming, I think is an important one. I remember when we were all walking around mask-free, and I also remember the day at the White House where the president went out and gave that speech after the CDC guidance had been issued, and he gave a speech and then he put his mask on, and then subsequently everyone else at the White House put their masks on. So, look, I think it's, as the chairman just noted, science changes. And what happens when you lead with science and not a communications plan, things such as this do arise. So I think that voters, though, are not as forgiving. They feel, a lot of people across the country feel, look, we've all gotten COVID at this point. I have not, but a lot of people have gotten COVID, and they're like, look, it's time to take these masks off and get back to normal. But the reality is that we are still in the midst of a global pandemic.
The broken link between the CDC guidance and the CDC's messaging, I think, has been a problem. We were talking about it with Mike in the last segment, the idea of, how the CDC informs the politics of this. People don't want the politics to drive the conversation here, but they do need the science and the politics to try to at least speak the same language. And that seems to have been a problem for the CDC of late.
Well, look, I think, again, the CDC, made up of scientists, career individuals who, frankly, after the last administration, felt attacked. They felt like their agency has been politicized. Ask anyone who was there during the Trump administration. They put out guidance and things purely based on pressure from the White House that was not backed up by science, that was not helpful to the American people during the Trump administration. So I do think that the people in the agency do feel some sense of, okay, we need to make sure we're leading with the science. I do want to remind folks, I remember when President Biden made his declaration about the boosters, and everyone, basically people wet their pants and they said, this is not backed by the science, this is not okay. Well, come to find out, the fact that Americans were boosted is what has prevented a lot of folks, frankly, from being hospitalized and dying from COVID-19.
The CDC doesn't have the worst messaging problem this week, Michael Steele. That's the Republican Party. We were talking yesterday to Republican senators about the RNC's censure of Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, and I can tell you, Republicans did not want to talk about it. Senators thought it was a terrible idea. They thought it was backward-looking. Is this a problem of reaping and sowing for Republicans who wouldn't take the Trump Band-Aid off much earlier?
Oh, absolutely. And, I'm sorry you don't want to talk about it, but, baby, you got to talk about it. Yep. All right? You don't get to hide behind your senatorial privilege of just blowing off the press. No, your party, my party, our party just declared itself anti-democratic by putting on the record that they thought what happened on January 6th was legitimate political protest. And that's just not right. So, yeah, I'm sorry, you got to answer. You got to answer the question, do you agree with that? And if you don't, then you need to shake the party down and get it off of this particular footing if you think you're going to be a governing majority in the future. It's not just about winning the election in 2020. That's great. But then what? What are we going back to? If Trumpism is the id inside this party, what does that say for how we govern in 23, 4, 5, et cetera? So, yeah, you got to own the moment. You don't get to walk away from it, senators, all of you, whether you're retiring or not. You own the moment. All of us out here taking the heat. You need to take it too.
Michael, I can feel you getting hot under the collar there.